In Manhattan's most exclusive ballroom, beneath soaring marble columns and crystal chandeliers, casting prismatic rainbows across mahogany floors, a bride's shame burned brighter than the imported candles themselves. Her future mother-in-law's voice sliced through perfumed air like surgical steel, each word reminding everyone that this woman in white came from nothing and would always be a gold digger clinging to their family name. The couture gown, adorned with royal pearls, couldn't shield her from accusations of being a fortune hunter desperate to escape poverty. Her groom stood paralyzed beside towering Ecuadorian roses, too terrified of his mother to defend the woman he claimed to love. In the shadow of gilded French mirrors, carpenter Blake Winters felt his 8-year-old daughter's hand tighten as they witnessed this public execution disguised as family bonding. Distinguished guests sipped champagne behind baccarat crystal, none daring to intervene as the bride's head hung lower with each cruel syllable. What no one suspected was that this humiliated woman carried secrets that could reshape more than just her own destiny. What happens when a working father's conscience collides with high society's cruelest traditions? Blake Winters had arrived at the Plaza Hotel that Saturday evening, feeling like a fish out of water, his calloused hands smoothing down his only decent suit jacket. His daughter Sage skipped beside him, her second-hand dress pressed to perfection, her excitement infectious despite their modest appearance among Manhattan's elite. They were here because Blake had restored the antique cabinets in Jonathan Hartwell's downtown loft 6 months ago, and the young man had insisted on inviting the craftsman who'd brought his grandmother's armoire back to life. Blake had tried to decline, knowing they didn't belong in this world of trust funds and country clubs, but Sage had been so thrilled at the prospect of seeing a real fairy tale wedding. Now, watching this nightmare unfold before his daughter's innocent eyes, Blake wondered if he should have trusted his instincts and stayed home. The bride, Camila Rodríguez, stood frozen as Mrs. Patricia Whitmore circled her like a predator, sizing up wounded prey. The older woman's diamond-encrusted fingers gestured dismissively at Camila's appearance, her voice carrying across the reception hall with surgical precision. "I specifically told the stylist to choose something more appropriate for our family's standards," Patricia announced to no one in particular, though her words were clearly meant for the assembled crowd. One would think that on such an important day, a bride would understand the significance of presentation. Her eyes swept over Camila's trembling form with undisguised disdain. The gown, which had cost more than Blake earned in 3 months, was apparently not expensive enough for the Whitmore matriarch. Sage tugged on her father's sleeve, her whisper barely audible above the string quartet. "Daddy, why is that lady being so mean to the princess?" Blake's jaw tightened as he watched Jonathan Whitmore shift uncomfortably beside his mother, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The man was 32 years old, heir to a shipping fortune, and he couldn't find the courage to defend his own bride. Blake had seen bullies before, had grown up with them in his working-class neighborhood in Queens, but he'd never witnessed such elegant cruelty dressed in designer clothes and practiced smiles. The other guests continued their conversations, pretending not to notice the systematic humiliation of a young woman who'd done nothing wrong except fall in love with a coward. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose another octave, ensuring her words reached every corner of the opulent ballroom. "I do hope you understand, dear, that joining our family comes with certain expectations," she said, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "We've worked very hard to maintain our reputation in this city, and appearances matter tremendously in our circles." She paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in. "Of course, I'm sure someone of your background can appreciate the importance of learning our ways." The word background dripped with such venom that several guests actually winced. Camila's face flushed crimson, her hands trembling so violently that her bouquet of white orchids rustled like autumn leaves. Blake felt something break inside his chest as he watched this woman's dignity being systematically dismantled. He remembered his ex-wife's family, the way they'd looked at him during their brief marriage, the constant reminders that he wasn't good enough for their precious daughter. He remembered the lawyers' offices, the custody battles, the way they'd tried to paint him as an unfit father simply because he worked with his hands instead of pushing papers behind a mahogany desk. But most of all, he remembered the promise he'd made to himself after his divorce was finalized, that he would never again stand by and watch someone be treated as less than human because of their social status. Sage's grip on his hand tightened, her young mind struggling to process the adult cruelty unfolding before them. "I know this is difficult for you to understand," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice now saccharine with false sympathy. "But families like ours have obligations. We can't simply ignore the fact that you bring nothing to this union except your romantic notions." She laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Jonathan needs a wife who can enhance his position, not someone who will require constant guidance in proper behavior." The bride's shoulders began to shake, whether from rage or despair, Blake couldn't tell. What he could see was a young woman being broken down piece by piece, her spirit crushed under the weight of expectations she could never meet. The wedding photographer, clearly uncomfortable, lowered his camera and stepped back into the shadows. Jonathan finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Mother, perhaps we could discuss this privately." His words trailed off as Patricia fixed him with a withering stare that could have frozen champagne. "There's nothing private about the reputation of our family, Jonathan," she replied icily. "And there's certainly nothing private about the choices we make in marriage." She turned back to Camila, her expression shifting to one of mock concern. "I'm only trying to help you understand what's expected, dear. Surely you want to be an asset to your new family, not a liability." The string quartet had stopped playing entirely now, the musicians sensing the toxic atmosphere that had settled over the reception like a suffocating blanket. Blake's carpenter hands, scarred from years of working with wood and metal, clenched into fists at his sides. He thought of his own daughter, imagined some future version of this scene where Sage stood in Camila's place, and his vision went white with protective rage. These people, with their inherited wealth and manufactured superiority, had no idea what real strength looked like. They'd never worked 16-hour days to keep food on the table, never held a crying child through nightmares caused by their own failures, never rebuilt their entire lives from nothing but determination and love. Yet here they stood, judging a young woman whose only crime was falling in love with their weak-willed son. The irony wasn't lost on Blake that the people who claimed to value strength were displaying none themselves. Mrs. Whitmore's voice grew sharper, her patience clearly exhausted with maintaining even the pretense of civility. "I think we all understand that this arrangement benefits you far more than it benefits us," she said, gesturing broadly to encompass the opulent surroundings. "After all, you're gaining access to society, connections, opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise." She paused, letting her words sink in like poison. "The least you can do is show some gratitude and make an effort to learn our ways." Camila's head dropped lower, her dark hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. But Blake could see her hands shaking, could see the tears falling onto the marble floor like raindrops, and something deep inside him snapped with an audible crack. Sage looked up at her father, confusion and distress warring in her 8-year-old features. "Daddy," she whispered, "why won't the prince save the princess?" The question hit Blake like a physical blow because his daughter was right. This wasn't a fairy tale at all, it was a horror story dressed in silk and diamonds. Jonathan stood there like a statue, his face pale but his feet firmly planted in cowardice. The other guests continued to nurse their champagne and pretend they couldn't hear every word of the verbal assault being conducted in front of them. Not one person in this room full of supposedly civilized, educated people had the basic human decency to speak up for someone who couldn't defend herself. Well, Blake decided, they were about to learn what real courage looked like. He straightened to his full height, his weathered face hardening into an expression that would have been recognizable to anyone who'd ever faced down a neighborhood bully. Blake Winters had spent 38 years on this earth, learning hard lessons about right and wrong, and he'd be damned if he'd let his daughter witness this kind of cruelty without consequence. His work boots clicked against the marble floor as he took his first step forward, each footfall echoing in the suddenly quiet ballroom like a judge's gavel. The distinguished guests began to notice the tall carpenter in the second-hand suit walking purposefully toward their exclusive circle, and conversations died away like lights being switched off one by one. "Excuse me," Blake's voice cut through the oppressive atmosphere like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His tone was calm, controlled, but carried an undercurrent of authority that made heads turn throughout the ballroom. Mrs. Whitmore looked up in surprise, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted by someone she would consider beneath her notice. "I'm sorry," Blake continued, his Queen's accent deliberate and unashamed, "but I think there's been enough talk for one evening." He moved to stand beside Camila, close enough that she could feel his presence, but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. The bride looked up in shock, tears streaming down her face, clearly unable to process why a stranger would involve himself in her humiliation. Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted from surprise to outrage in the span of a heartbeat. "I'm sorry, who are you exactly?" she demanded, her voice sharp with indignation. "This is a private family matter, and I don't recall anyone asking for your opinion." Her diamond earrings caught the light as she turned her full attention to this unexpected intruder, her eyes narrowing as she took in his working-class appearance and obvious lack of pedigree. Blake felt the weight of every gaze in the room, knew that he was crossing lines that would have consequences, but he also felt his daughter's hand slip into his and draw strength from her trust. "My name is Blake Winters," he said simply, "and I'm someone who believes that treating people with basic human dignity shouldn't be a revolutionary concept, even in circles like this." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of Camila's muffled sobs. Blake could feel the tension radiating from Jonathan, who looked like he might faint or flee at any moment. The other guests stood frozen, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, clearly unsure how to react to this breach of social protocol. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone through several shades of red and was now approaching purple, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the fury building behind her eyes. "How dare you!" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you come into our celebration and presume to lecture us about dignity?" She took a step closer to Blake, her posture radiating the kind of barely controlled rage that comes from someone unaccustomed to being challenged. Blake didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't lower his eyes in the way that people like Mrs. Whitmore expected from people like him. Instead, he looked directly at her, his expression calm but implacable. "Ma'am, I've spent my whole life building things, fixing things that are broken," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "But I've never seen anything as broken as a family that thinks love comes with conditions and respect is something you have to earn through bloodlines and bank accounts." He gestured gently toward Camila, who was staring at him with something approaching disbelief. "This young woman doesn't deserve your cruelty just because she doesn't come from money. Nobody does." Sage stepped forward then, her small voice cutting through the adult tensions with the clarity that only children possess. "The mean lady is making the princess cry," she announced to the assembled crowd, her tone matter-of-fact but accusatory. "That's not how weddings are supposed to work." Several guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly seeing the scene through a child's eyes and finding it wanting. Mrs. Whitmore looked down at Sage with unconcealed disdain, clearly about to deliver some cutting remark, but Blake's protective instincts flared like a struck match. "Don't," he said quietly, but with such menace that the older woman actually took a step backward. "Don't you dare speak to my daughter that way." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and even Jonathan looked up from his paralyzed stupor. Mrs. Whitmore regained her composure with visible effort, her years of social manipulation reasserting themselves. "I think you've made your point, Mr." She paused deliberately. "Winters, was it? But this is neither the time nor the place for your particular brand of working-class philosophy." Her smile was arctic as she prepared to deliver what she clearly thought would be a killing blow. "Perhaps you should return to whatever construction site or factory you crawled out of and leave matters of society to those who understand them." The insult hung in the air like smoke, designed to humiliate Blake into retreat. But if Mrs. Whitmore expected him to slink away with his tail between his legs, she had badly miscalculated her opponent. Blake's smile was slow and dangerous, the kind of expression that had made bullies think twice back in his neighborhood growing up. "You know what, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, using her name like a weapon. "You're absolutely right. I don't understand your kind of society. I don't understand how people can spend more on flowers than most families earn in a year and still think they're somehow better than everyone else." He looked around the opulent ballroom, taking in the excessive wealth on display. "I don't understand how someone can wear diamonds worth more than a house and still feel the need to tear down a young woman on what should be the happiest day of her life." His voice began to rise, carrying to every corner of the room. "And I sure as hell don't understand how a mother can raise a son who's too much of a coward to defend the woman he supposedly loves." Jonathan flinched as if he'd been slapped, his face going from pale to bright red in seconds. "Now see here," he began, but his voice cracked on the second word, undermining any authority he might have tried to project. Blake turned to look at him, his expression a mixture of pity and disgust. "No, you see here," Blake replied, his carpenter's hands spread wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire wedding party. "I've met plenty of men in my life, worked alongside them, fought beside them when necessary, and I can tell you something about real strength. It doesn't come from trust funds or family names or the size of your bank account." He stepped closer to Jonathan, who actually backed away. "It comes from standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. It comes from doing the right thing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The bride, Camila, had been silent throughout this exchange, her tears flowing freely, but her posture slowly beginning to straighten. Something in Blake's words, or perhaps his simple act of intervention, seemed to be awakening something within her that had been buried under months of psychological assault from her future in-laws. She looked up at this stranger who had risked social suicide to defend her, this working man who possessed more courage than anyone in her privileged circle, and for the first time in hours, her voice found strength. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that only Blake and Sage could hear her. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth defending." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of accumulated hurt and isolation. Blake nodded to her, his expression gentling. "Ma'am, I don't know you, and I don't know your story," he said, his voice kind but firm. "But I know enough to see that you deserve better than this. Every person deserves to be treated with respect and kindness, especially by the people who claim to love them." He glanced meaningfully at Jonathan, who was staring at his shoes like they held the secrets of the universe. "Love isn't about changing someone to fit your expectations. It's about accepting them as they are and standing beside them when the world gets rough." Mrs. Whitmore made a sound of disgust, but Blake ignored her completely, focusing his attention on the young woman whose wedding day had become a public humiliation. Camilla's hands had stopped trembling, and she was looking at Blake with an expression that was part gratitude, part revelation. 3 months of engagement to Jonathan had taught her to accept smaller and smaller portions of respect, to make herself quieter and more agreeable, to shrink herself down to a size that wouldn't offend anyone. But here was a man she'd never met, a carpenter in an off-the-rack suit, willing to risk the wrath of New York society to remind her that she was worth more than their grudging tolerance. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I do deserve better than this." She looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of people who had watched her humiliation without lifting a finger to help. "I deserve much better than this." Mrs. Whitmore sensed the shift in atmosphere and moved quickly to reassert control. "This is absurd," she announced to the room at large. "We're allowing some random tradesman to disrupt our family celebration with his pedestrian moralizing." She turned back to Camilla, her expression hardening into something approaching hatred. "And you, dear, would do well to remember exactly what you stand to lose if you allow yourself to be influenced by such common perspectives." The threat was clear, hanging in the air like a sword ready to fall. Jonathan's position in society, his trust fund, his family connections, all of that goes away if you choose to make scenes and embrace vulgarity. Her smile was cold as winter rain. "I wonder how long your romantic ideals will last when you're back to waiting tables or whatever it is people like you do for work." The cruel words hit their mark, and Camilla's newfound confidence wavered for a moment. She looked at Jonathan, searching his face for any sign that he would contradict his mother, any indication that their relationship meant more to him than his family's approval and his trust fund security. But Jonathan remained silent, his cowardice on full display for everyone to witness. Blake watched this internal struggle play out across Camilla's features, and felt his heart break a little for this young woman caught between her principles and her survival. He knew that feeling, had lived through the pressure to compromise his values for financial stability, and he wouldn't wish that kind of soul-crushing choice on anyone. But then Sage did something that changed everything. The 8-year-old walked directly up to Camilla, her patent leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, and took the bride's trembling hand in both of her small ones. "My mommy used to say mean things about my daddy, too," she said in her clear, innocent voice that carried throughout the silent ballroom. "She said he wasn't good enough, and that we didn't have nice things like other families." Tears began forming in Sage's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "But Daddy is the best person I know, and we don't need mean people in our family. You don't need them either." The simple wisdom of a child cut through all the social posturing and financial manipulation like a knife through silk. Camila knelt down to Sage's eye level, her designer gown pooling around her on the marble floor. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Sage," the little girl replied with a gap-toothed smile. "And I think you're the most beautiful princess I've ever seen, even when you're sad." Camilla's tears began flowing again. But these were different tears. Not the bitter tears of humiliation, but the cleansing tears of someone remembering their own worth. "Thank you, Sage," she whispered. "You and your father have reminded me of something very important." She stood slowly, her posture straightening, her shoulders pulling back as if she were shedding an invisible weight that had been crushing her for months. Mrs. Whitmore, sensing that she was losing control of the situation, played her final card. "Camilla, dear, I think you're being very foolish," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You're throwing away everything you've worked for, everything we've offered you, for the romantic notions of strangers who don't understand our world." She gestured dismissively toward Blake and Sage. "These people will go back to their little lives, and where will you be then? You'll have nothing. No husband, no family, no security." Her eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "And don't think for one moment that Jonathan will choose you over his family. He knows where his bread is buttered." The older woman's confidence was absolute. She had used this same psychological warfare to control people for decades. But as Camila looked around the ballroom, at the guests who had watched her humiliation with entertainment rather than sympathy, at the groom who valued his mother's approval more than his bride's dignity, at the opulent surroundings that had become a gilded cage. Something crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She thought about the company she had built from nothing, the late nights and early mornings, the innovative software solutions that were revolutionizing supply chain management. She thought about the board meetings where she had commanded respect through competence rather than inheritance, the employees who looked up to her leadership, the deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars that bore her signature. Most importantly, she thought about the merger proposal sitting in her briefcase back at the hotel, the deal that would save Whitmore Industries from bankruptcy and make her the majority shareholder of the combined entity. "You're right about one thing, Mrs. Whitmore," Camila said, her voice now carrying a strength that made several guests straighten up and take notice. "I do need to remember exactly what I stand to lose." She looked directly at Jonathan, who was still studying his shoes like a guilty schoolboy. "But I think you have it backwards. You see, I'm not some desperate girl clinging to your family for security. I'm Camila Rodríguez, founder and CEO of TechNova Corporation." The name meant nothing to most of the wedding guests, but Blake noticed that a few of the business leaders in attendance suddenly looked very interested. "My company has been in negotiations with Whitmore Industries for the past 6 months regarding a merger that would save your family business from complete financial collapse." Mrs. Whitmore's face went through several interesting color changes, settling on a shade that reminded Blake of old concrete. "That's impossible," she sputtered, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Jonathan never mentioned. You never said." She turned to her son, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the marble floor. "Jonathan, what is she talking about?" But Jonathan remained silent, apparently struck mute by this revelation. Several of the guests had pulled out their phones and were presumably Googling TechNova Corporation, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern to something approaching panic as they realized the implications of what they were witnessing. Camila continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The deal would have been worth $500 million and would have given me controlling interest in the combined company." She looked around the room, noting how the dynamics had suddenly shifted now that these people understood she wasn't some penniless fortune hunter, but a successful businesswoman in her own right. "Your family's shipping business has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years, Mrs. Whitmore. Without this merger, Whitmore Industries will be bankrupt within 18 months. The silence that followed this announcement was profound, broken only by the sound of champagne glasses being set down on marble surfaces with unusual care. Blake watched this transformation with something approaching awe. The broken, humiliated woman from moments ago had vanished, replaced by a confident executive who clearly knew exactly what kind of power she wielded. But more than that, he could see in her eyes the same fire that had driven him to start his own carpentry business after being laid off from the factory. The same determination to prove wrong everyone who had ever underestimated him. "So, you see," Camila continued, addressing Mrs. Whitmore directly, "I'm not the one who has everything to lose here. I built my company from nothing, just like your husband built his fortune 3 generations ago, except I did it without inheriting seed money or family connections." Her smile was sharp as broken glass. "The question isn't whether I'm good enough for your family. The question is whether your family is good enough for me." Mrs. Whitmore opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. For perhaps the first time in her privileged life, she found herself completely outmaneuvered and outclassed. The other guests were now whispering urgently among themselves, the implications of this revelation rippling through the crowd like aftershocks from an earthquake. Blake felt Sage's hand squeeze his, and he looked down to see his daughter watching the proceedings with wide-eyed fascination. "Daddy," she whispered, "is the princess actually a queen?" Blake couldn't help but smile at his daughter's question. "Something like that, sweetheart," he replied. "Something exactly like that." Jonathan finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. "Camila, I didn't know you felt." But his words trailed off as she fixed him with a look that could have frozen fire. "You didn't know because you never asked," she said simply. "In 6 months of engagement, you never once inquired about my work beyond making jokes about me playing with computers. You never asked about my dreams, my goals, what I wanted out of life beyond being your decorative wife." She gestured to the opulent surroundings. "You assumed I would be grateful for the privilege of joining your family, no matter how they treated me, because you couldn't imagine that I might have options of my own." The bride reached into her small clutch purse and withdrew her engagement ring, the massive diamond catching the chandelier light and throwing rainbows across the marble floor. "I won't be needing this anymore," she said, placing it on the nearest table with a small click that seemed to echo through the silent ballroom. "And you won't be needing the merger that would have saved your family's business." She looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore, whose face had gone from purple to grey as the full implications sank in. "I think I'll be exploring other opportunities. Perhaps with the Steinberg Group. They've been very interested in acquiring my technology." Blake didn't know who the Steinberg Group was, but from the gasps around the room, he gathered they were probably Whitmore Industries' biggest competitors. Mrs. Whitmore finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. "You can't be serious. This is all just pre-wedding nerves, perfectly natural under the circumstances." She took a step toward Camila, her hands extended in what might have been intended as a placating gesture. "We can work through this. Find a way to—" But Camila held up one hand, and the older woman stopped mid-sentence as if she'd hit an invisible wall. "Mrs. Whitmore," Camila said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom negotiations, "I've spent the last 3 months allowing you and your family to systematically destroy my self-confidence, because I thought that's what love required. Compromise, sacrifice, becoming smaller so others could feel bigger." She looked around the ballroom one final time. "But this man and his daughter reminded me who I really am." She turned to Blake, who was still standing beside her like a guardian angel in an off-the-rack suit. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for showing me that real strength isn't about inherited wealth or social position. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something." Blake felt his cheeks warm under her grateful gaze. "Ma'am, you don't owe me any thanks," he replied. "You found your own strength. I just reminded you it was there." Sage nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old logic. "Sometimes people forget they're strong," she announced to the assembled crowd, "but they remember when someone believes in them." The string quartet had long since packed up their instruments and fled, leaving the ballroom in an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic far below. The distinguished guests stood frozen like mannequins, their champagne growing flat in their hands as they processed the social and financial earthquake they had just witnessed. Several of the business leaders were already on their phones, presumably alerting their own companies to the sudden vulnerability of Whitmore Industries and the opportunity that presented. Blake realized that his simple act of defending a stranger had inadvertently triggered what would probably be front-page news in the financial section tomorrow morning. Camila walked to where the photographer cowered behind his camera equipment and extended her hand. "I'll need those memory cards," she said politely but firmly. "All of them." The photographer, clearly eager to distance himself from what had become a public relations disaster, handed over the cards without protest. "Thank you," she said, dropping them into her purse. "I think that's enough documentation of this particular family gathering." She looked back at the Whitmore family, taking in Jonathan's stricken expression and his mother's barely contained fury. "I'll have my attorney contact yours regarding the merger termination," she added almost as an afterthought. I believe there are some penalty clauses that will need to be addressed. Mrs. Whitmore's composure finally cracked completely. You little nobody, she snarled, her carefully cultivated veneer of sophistication falling away to reveal the ruthless operator beneath. You think you can humiliate our family and get away with it? Do you have any idea who we are, what kind of connections we have? Her voice rose to a screech that made several guests wince. We'll destroy you. Do you understand? We'll make sure you never work in this city again. But even as she made these threats, Blake could see the desperation behind them. This was a woman watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time, and her threats rang hollow in the marble-walled ballroom. Camila's smile was serene as she adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her board of directors when TechNova had landed its first major contract. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate your passion, but I think you misunderstand the situation, she said, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Your family needs me far more than I need you. My company is worth 3 times what your husband's business was at its peak, and unlike inherited wealth, I earned every dollar through innovation and hard work. She paused, letting this sink in. You're welcome to try to destroy me, but I should mention that I have contracts with 6 of your biggest clients and acquisition offers from 4 of your major competitors. Burning bridges with me would be inadvisable. Blake watched this exchange with growing amazement. This woman had been reduced to tears by psychological bullying just minutes ago, but now she was calmly demonstrating the kind of quiet power that came from genuine achievement rather than inherited privilege. He thought about his own journey from factory worker to successful business owner, the nights he'd spent learning new techniques and building his reputation one satisfied customer at a time. There was something deeply satisfying about watching someone who had earned their success face down people who had simply been born into theirs. Sage tugged on Camila's gown, and the CEO knelt down to the little girl's level once again. Are you going to be okay, princess? Sage asked with the direct concern that only children possess. Camila's smile was genuine and warm as she looked into those innocent eyes. I'm going to be just fine, sweetheart, she replied. Thanks to you and your father, I remembered something very important about myself today. She glanced up at Blake, who was watching this interaction with obvious pride in his daughter's compassion. Would you like to get some ice cream and leave these people to figure out their problems without us? Sage's face lit up like Christmas morning, and she nodded enthusiastically. The 3 of them walked toward the ballroom exit together, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly cavernous space. Behind them, the Whitmore family and their guests stood like survivors of a natural disaster, trying to process what had just happened and what it would mean for their carefully ordered world. Blake could hear Mrs. Whitmore's voice rising again, presumably berating Jonathan for his part in this debacle, but the words seemed to come from very far away. As they reached the ornate doorway, Camila paused and looked back one final time at what should have been her wedding reception. Goodbye, Jonathan, she said quietly, though her words carried clearly in the hushed room. I hope someday you find the courage to become the man you could be instead of the man your mother wants you to be. 6 months later, Blake was putting the finishing touches on a custom entertainment center when his phone buzzed with a news alert. TechNova Corporation completes acquisition of Steinberg Industries in record-breaking deal, the headline read. He smiled as he set down his sandpaper and opened the full article, which featured a photograph of Camila cutting a ribbon at the opening of TechNova's new headquarters. She looked confident and radiant, every inch the successful CEO she had always been, even when others couldn't see it. The article mentioned that she had recently established the Rodríguez Foundation, which provided business mentorship and startup funding for entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. Blake was surprised when his doorbell rang that evening, and even more surprised to find Camila standing on his doorstep with Sage's hand in hers. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, she said, her smile shy but genuine. Sage and I have been having ice cream dates once a week since the wedding, and she insisted I come see the treehouse you built for her. Blake looked from the successful CEO to his daughter, who was practically bouncing with excitement. You didn't tell me you'd been seeing Camila, he said, his tone gently accusatory. Sage grinned up at him. She's been helping me with my math homework, she announced proudly, and she's teaching me about computers. Did you know she built her whole company from her bedroom when she was in college? Over dinner that night, served on Blake's mismatched plates in his modest kitchen, Camila told them about the past 6 months. The Whitmore Industries bankruptcy had made national news, with financial analysts praising her strategic decision to withdraw from the merger. The irony is that Jonathan actually called last week, she said, helping Sage with her homework at the kitchen table. Apparently, he finally found his backbone after his trust fund evaporated. He wanted to apologize and ask if we could try again. Blake looked up from the dishes he was washing, curious about her response. I told him I was happy he was growing as a person, but that ship had sailed, Camila continued. I've learned that you can't build a future with someone who doesn't respect your present. As the weeks turned into months, their friendship deepened into something more profound. Blake found himself looking forward to their Sunday dinners, to the way Camila listened to Sage's stories with genuine interest, to the comfortable silences they shared while working in his garden. Camila, for her part, discovered a peace in the simple rhythms of their life that all her professional success hadn't provided. She loved watching Blake work with his hands, creating beautiful things from raw materials, and she marveled at the way he had raised such a thoughtful, confident daughter, despite the challenges of single parenthood. One evening, nearly a year after that disastrous wedding, Blake found Camila on his back porch, teaching Sage how to identify constellations. The sight of them together, heads bent over a star chart, made his heart do something complicated in his chest. Did you know, Camila was saying, that sailors used to navigate by the stars? They had to trust that the patterns would guide them home. Sage nodded solemnly. Like how Daddy trusted that standing up for you was the right thing to do, even though he didn't know you. Camila looked over at Blake, who was leaning against the doorframe watching them with obvious affection. Exactly like that, she said softly. When Blake proposed 8 months later, it was with a ring he had crafted himself from reclaimed wood and a simple diamond that caught the light like a promise. The ceremony was held in his backyard, under the oak tree, where Sage's treehouse swayed gently in the breeze, with only their closest friends in attendance. Camila wore a simple white dress that cost a fraction of her first wedding gown, but made her look more radiant than any designer creation ever could. As they exchanged vows they had written themselves, Blake promised to always see her worth, regardless of what the world might think, and Camila promised to never again make herself smaller to fit someone else's expectations. TechNova continued to thrive under Camila's leadership, becoming known not just for innovation, but for its ethical business practices and commitment to employee development. The Rodríguez Foundation grew into a major force for economic opportunity, and Camila often spoke at conferences about the importance of courage in business and in life. She always credited a carpenter and his 8-year-old daughter with reminding her who she really was on the day when she needed it most. Blake expanded his workshop and began teaching carpentry classes to veterans and at-risk youth, finding deep satisfaction in passing on skills that provided both practical ability and personal confidence. Sage, now 10 years old and officially adopted by Camila, had grown into a remarkable young woman who combined her father's moral compass with her stepmother's strategic thinking. She often accompanied Camila to the office during school breaks, learning about business and technology, while never forgetting the simple values that had shaped her childhood. When friends asked her about her unusual family story, she would simply say that sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you choose to build together through love, respect, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. On quiet evenings, when the dishes were done and Sage was asleep in her room, Blake and Camilla would sit on their porch and talk about the strange paths that had brought them together. They often marveled at how a single moment of moral courage had changed not just their lives, but the trajectory of an entire industry, as TechNova's ethical approach influenced competitors and reshaped business practices. But mostly, they were grateful for the simple truth that had emerged from that chaos, that real wealth isn't measured in stock portfolios or social connections, but in the love we share, the principles we uphold, and the courage we find to stand up for what matters most when the stakes are highest and the outcome uncertain.